Hello everybody, hopefully you haven't forgotten about René Descartes. We discussed him before in the context of rationalism, the view that truth and knowledge are dependent upon a priori reason. Now we are going to discuss his philosophy as it relates to dualism. The very same thought experiments that led him to be a rationalist led him to a dualistic worldview. In fact, the two are tightly linked. This is because Descartes, if you recall, became convinced of his existence even when he assumed that he was being manipulated by an all-powerful demon. This demon, you remember, had the ability to fool him about anything that is possible to be fooled about, from mathematical facts to whether or not he had a body. It is this later fact that is important here. Since he ended up concluding that he can know that he existed without knowing he had a body, he concluded that his existence was not dependent upon a body. In portions of his work which we did not discuss at length and which have numerous problems, he became convinced that the material world also exists. A major reason he had for believing this was that he believed that he could know that God exists through the ontological argument, and then that God was no deceiver, and therefore in a general sense, his sensory instincts are trustworthy. We will discuss the ontological argument later in the semester, but the point here is that he became convinced that he was fundamentally a mind that was not dependent upon a body, but which was nevertheless in a body. Thus he believed that people had a dual nature, their bodies which are not fundamental to their existence, and their minds which are. The mind or soul is what is fundamental to one's personal identity under this view, because Descartes believed that thinking things such as himself could exist without a body. Before going further, we should talk about a couple important metaphysical terms. These terms deal with what kind of stuff or substance exists in the universe. A substance is the philosophical word for the fundamental stuff out of which other things are composed. Monism is the belief that there is only one basic kind of stuff in the universe. Both idealism and materialism are monist philosophies. Idealism believes that only mental stuff exists, and materialism or physicalism holds that only physical stuff exists. Dualists, on the other hand, hold that both physical and mental substances exist. These substances are fundamentally different in nature. Mental substance does not have any physical properties such as size or shape or motion or location in space. Material or physical substances have size, shape, definite physical location, and so forth. Though we should note that physicists, who are overwhelmingly materialists, have a slightly more complex view when discussing quantum physics, under which particles can be in more than one place at a time and interact strangely over larger distances. The main idea here, though, is that mental and physical substances are entirely different. It is important to remember this point for later. You might notice, by the way, that sometimes I use the word materialism and sometimes I use the word physicalism. These refer to essentially the same theory, but physicalism is probably more technically correct since we are talking about a system which contains both matter and energy as well as space-time. In addition, this has the advantage of not getting confused with other philosophical understandings of the word materialism, such as those associated with political and economic philosophy. Both dualistic and monistic theories have some very serious problems that they have to contend with. Descartes' particular brand of dualism is known as interactive dualism. It is called interactive dualism because it is the view that while both mental and physical substances exist, the mind, by which he does not mean the physical brain, and body can interact. There are other forms of dualism as well, such as parallelism, which is the belief that mental stuff exists and physical stuff also exists, but that they cannot interact with each other. Instead, under a parallelist dualist view, mental and physical stuff are synchronized so that they appear to correlate with each other, much like the sound and video of a movie. There are also various forms of epiphenomenalism, which is one-way interactionism. Under this view, both mental and physical stuff exists. The physical can affect the mental, but the mental cannot affect the physical. As an analogy, you can think of how the physical position of the moon affects the tides, but the tides do not affect the position of the moon. Although this is an imperfect analogy since the tides actually do affect the moon, but in a very minor way. As a result, the moon is getting further and further away each year. But since there may be no perfect analogies for epiphenomenalism, precisely because physical items interact with each other, this analogy will have to do. For this lecture, we are concerned with interactive dualism, which again is the view that both physical and mental substances exist and that they can affect one another. Here's a schematic of an interactive dualist worldview. Physical events can cause mental events. For example, imagine a hot stove. If you touch a hot stove, which is a physical event, it will cause the mental event of burning pain. Likewise, mental events can cause physical events. When you touched the stove and found it to be hot, the pain caused the physical event of you pulling your hand away. That is why this theory is called interactive dualism. Physical and mental substances interact with each other. Mental events can cause physical events, and physical events can cause mental events. This is a view that most of you are probably quite familiar with. It fits nicely with the popular belief that we have fundamental immaterial selves called the soul, which can exist independently of our bodies. Our bodies can cause our souls to experience things, and our souls can cause our bodies to do things. Note that under this view, minds are fundamentally separated from one another. My mental world and that of another person can never directly interact with each other. This can lead to the problem of solipsism. This is the view that oneself is the only conscious entity in the universe. This is because one can have evidence of a physical world, but no direct action with the mental world of others. There is no way to directly interact with other minds. So, for example, if person A says something to person B, such as, "You are annoying me," person A does not directly make his feelings known to person B. Person A instead does something to the physical world, in this case produce sound waves. Those sound waves, which are part of the physical world, in turn affect person B's body, causing a mental event in person B. That mental event is the sensation of hearing sounds and translating them into the words, "You are annoying me." Solipsists deny, however, that there is any mind that produced the words, "You are annoying me." All the solipsist says she has evidence of is the physical world and that the body is producing these sounds. That other human form could simply be acting mechanically, having no mind at all. This is not the belief that it is an electronic robot, but that it is merely physical, operating under physical laws, mechanistically. Descartes was not a solipsist, and in fact, there are not many philosophers who seriously endorse solipsism. Instead, solipsism is a philosophical problem that needs to be overcome. How does one justify the belief in other minds? But while Descartes rejected the solipsistic view of other people, he believed that animals are just biological machines and have no mental activity. A dog may yelp, but Descartes denied that this was the result of a mental event of pain. He therefore had no problem with vivisecting animals like dogs. Vivisection is the dissection of an animal while it is still alive in order to see what makes it tick. Such a dog might howl and whimper, but Descartes would deny that there was ever any mind behind these sounds. In fact, he actually did this to his wife's dog in order to prove that they were mere machines. So why did he believe that humans had minds and other animals did not? Because he believed that the mind was the result of having a soul, which he believed that, out of all the animals, only humans possess. Descartes' interactive dualistic view worked the following way. He believed that the mind and body interact via a small gland in the brain called the pineal gland. This gland is roughly in the center of the brain. So according to his schematic, the physical world interacts with the body, which is also physical. This causes stimulation to us through our sense organs. But prior to our being aware of any senses, these impulses travel to the pineal gland where they cause mental action in the soul. The soul likewise can, through the pineal gland, cause actions in the body. This view is sometimes called the Cartesian theater. It is as if we are little people sitting inside our own heads, like a pilot of a robotic body. That body isn't really part of our fundamental selves, though we have panels in front of us through which we can sense and move it around. The input from our senses is as if images are being broadcast onto screens in front of us, coming from cameras in the eyes or sounds through speakers connected to the ears. Of course, modern science would seem to indicate that it is the pineal gland that is the part of our brain most related to conscious experience. Therefore, modern dualists do not think that there is anything special about this gland metaphysically. Of course, from a scientific perspective, most neurologists are physicalists who reject the existence of a separate mind substance. But interactive dualism is very much alive in the common view, and there are still some dualist philosophers, though many of them are not interactive dualists. This view, that of the Cartesian theater, is sometimes called the ghost in the machine. It is sometimes also referred to as the homunculus problem. The word homunculus is Latin for little man. This is because one big problem with the Cartesian theater seems to be that it just pushes the problem backwards. It seems to make some intuitive sense that we can be inside of a thing looking out. After all, we all know what it's like to be, for example, in a house looking out a window, but we should be careful of proposals that make intuitive sense because, as we have learned from science, our intuitions are probably wrong more often than not. In this case, the Cartesian theater arguably doesn't really explain consciousness at all, because it would seem like we need another us inside of the us that is watching the theater image. That even tinier consciousness in turn would seem to need another consciousness inside of it, and so on to infinity, or what is known as an infinite regress. Each person appears to need another littler person inside of him or her, hence the term homunculus problem. There are, apart from solipsism and the homunculus problem, some other major problems with interactive dualism. Perhaps the biggest problem for interactive dualism is the interactive bit. Remember what we said about mental substance. Mental substance doesn't have any properties in common with physical substance. Physical substance has properties like location in space, dimension, motion, and so forth, but it does not have consciousness. Mental substance does not have a location in space, dimension, or motion, but it does have consciousness. The term consciousness, by the way, should not be confused with the word conscience. Consciousness refers to mental awareness. So if this is true, how can a mental substance, such as the mind or soul, cause any effect in a physical substance, such as that which makes up the human body? They have no commonalities upon which to interact. Material items can interact with each other because they have these properties in common. For example, physical objects make contact with one another in space and transmit motion or energy to one another. But a material object cannot make contact with an immaterial object. The answer that it just does isn't helpful. There's no obvious mechanism by which this can occur, and if such interaction is a problem, then interactive dualism has a problem. Notice that monist theories do not have this problem. Whether it is physicalism or idealism, it makes sense for like substances to be able to interact with each other. Although it should be noted that these monist theories have problems of their own. A third problem is that interactive dualism seems to fly in the face of what we know about physics. Science has been tremendously successful, and part of the success is built on the idea that physics is causally closed. Every physical event has a physical explanation. Energy, for example, is conserved, that is to say, neither created nor destroyed. But the motion of any object, including our bodies, requires energy, and all of this energy seems to be accounted for mechanically. For an immaterial substance to have some effect on our behavior would mean that it would have to break this closed causality and violate the conservation of energy. If I behave differently because of a mind or soul, then that mind or soul must be causing the neurons to fire, and this requires energy. This is not a small problem, and though I do not have a nifty picture that can illustrate this abstract concept, it is an important objection. It should also be noted that I am setting aside some of the more confusing aspects of quantum physics, which is often interpreted to allow for random events at a quantum level. The great success of science is part of the reason why many of those philosophers who are dualists have taken up theories such as epiphenomenalism, which we mentioned earlier, and a theory we haven't mentioned called property dualism. And that about wraps it up for this presentation. Until next time.